Welcome to Variables in OutSystems. In this session, we will discuss variables and how they're used, including the types of variables, such as input parameters, output parameters, and local variables. We'll also talk about two compound data types, structures and lists. Let's get started. Variables are locations in memory that can hold data. They will hold data of a particular data type, which can be any data type that we want it to be. A variable is defined and will exist in a particular scope, so that means that the value can be accessed and modified inside of that scope. If the execution leaves that area or scope, it will destroy the variable. In OutSystems, variables can be input parameters, local variables, or output parameters. Here, we can see an example of a server action. This action has several input parameters, like the check-in date, the checkout date, and the number of guests. It also has some outputs, like the room price and the room number. It also has a local variable that will hold information about a specific room. All of these variables would be interacting and working inside the scope of the bookroom action. Let's talk a bit about each one of them in more detail. We'll start with the input parameter. The input parameter allows you to pass a value from the outside scope to the parent scope. Each input parameter has a few properties, and one of those properties defines whether the input parameter is mandatory or not. If mandatory, that parameter has to have a value assigned to it when it is passed in. All input parameters get destroyed when the execution leaves the scope of the parent element. Therefore, whenever the server action finishes and the execution moves to the outer scope, the input parameter is no longer available. We can also have output parameters. An output parameter will return a value from inside the parent scope to the outside scope. Inside the scope where the output parameter is defined, a value should be assigned to it. One big difference between input and output parameters is that the output parameter will continue to exist in the outside scope. It does not get destroyed, as happens with inputs. Finally, there are local variables. These variables exist exclusively within the scope of their parent element. They can be assigned, or set, and used locally inside of the scope, which is why we refer to them as local variables. Similar to inputs, local variables are destroyed whenever their parent scope finishes. We've seen the different types of variables. One important aspect is that the OutSystems language is strongly typed. This means that all variables must have a data type defined, and throughout the execution that data type does not change. As for data types themselves, OutSystems supports three kinds. The basic types include integers, text, or dates. Compound types are a composition of other data types. For example, we have entities or structures. Finally, OutSystems also supports lists, which represent sequences of values of the same data type. By now, you should have heard of entities. A similar compound data type is a structure. Besides having attributes of basic data types, structures may also contain attributes of other compound or list data types. One major difference between entities and structures is that structures are used to store data in memory, and they are the definition of a data type. This means that the structure itself does not hold a value, but you may have a variable whose data type is set to a structure. That variable would be able to store data in memory. To create a structure, we can just go to the structure folder in the Data tab and right-click it to add a new structure defining its name. As for the attributes, it is mandatory to have at least one attribute. To create a structure attribute, right-click the structure and add a new one. Set its name and select the data type. You may also set it to be mandatory, and if it is not mandatory, you can set its default value. Lists are another important data type that will be used quite often. Essentially, a list is a collection of elements of the same data type. Within a single list, all elements have the exact same data type, which can be a basic type, a compound type, or a union of different types. The data type of the list can be defined in the data type editor. Inside it, you can define the data type of the list elements.